Welcome to Unlikely Intersections, a podcast where intent, impact, and inquiry inspire our conversations. The interesting thing about intersections is that we all face many every day, and the way we navigate those determines the trajectory of our days and our lives. I'm Dr. Philip Brown with my good friend Terry Jackson, and we are so excited today to have a special guest, Dr. Umbreen Nahal. Umbreen, I would love for you to tell our audience a little bit about yourself with a takeaway of if there were maybe three things the audience should know about you before we get started, what would they be?
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And I love the intro about how you can control the trajectory of your day as well as your life. It's great. I describe myself as a human ping pong ball.
Mm.
So when people ask me about, home, or actually even honestly, if they ask me about, what's your name, I'm just like, well, how much time do you have? In that actually my name typically would be spelled Ambreen, but my mother spelled it a bit differently. So even that becomes a conversation point. But so I've lived in multiple countries. I was born in the US to immigrant parents from Pakistan. Although if you trace our history, we're mutts, so I'm a mutt and I'm a ping pong ball. And went to medical school in Pakistan, actually, despite having started college in the US, and lived in Saudi Arabia, where my dad had a job with an oil company, and traveled in Europe. So I like to, but I think what that's allowed me to do is, we hear a lot about empathy, but I'm a bit of a critic of empathy along the lines of Paul Bloom from Yale, a professor who says that, maybe we should have more rational compassion. So maybe that's the second thing I would say about me is I like to be both compassionate and rational. And I think there's an innate tension sometimes between the heart and the head, and we need to find that, again, intersection between those two. And the third thing is I like to snowshoe. I think there's a funny Winnie the Pooh, I think, quote that like when you see somebody putting on their boots, they're going on an adventure. And when I put on my snowshoes, even if I'm just going down a pretty sedate path in a park, it feels like you're going on an adventure.
That is brilliant. I'm glad to know that about you. It really just underscores, because you and I spent a little bit of time together recently online, and that's another thing I didn't know. So it's fantastic to enrich those relationships. Today we're going to talk a little bit about how workplace diversity makes it possible to deliver equitable care, but really coming at it from a different angle, which was your idea, and I think is a very powerful one. And so just talking about the whole concept of intersectionality, and I think maybe a good place to start for our audience might be to define that a little bit for them.
Absolutely. So I think there's the aspects of identity that are visual, right? So somebody can look at me and say that I appear to be female. I appear to be, some people can right away tell that I'm South Asian. Some people can be like, she's something. She could maybe be white, but not really, right? And there's a concept of like being white passing or white adjacent. So, but then there's so many other dimensions. We're essentially, even in terms of when I coach people on communication, this is something I've been learning because you've probably already noticed I like to use a lot of words, and we are essentially like diamonds, right? And we have multiple facets. And when you look at a diamond, you see its brilliance, but you can't appreciate every individual facet. So as humans, there are many, and if you were to try to actually see all of the facets cut into a diamond, it would take too long, and it's impossible, and you would probably feel like you kind of go a little crazy. And I don't mean to be ableist, but it would just make your brain unhappy, right? So when you communicate, you have to choose, just like you said, tell me three things about yourself. You have to choose what parts you present. And there's a book, even though it's a little pejorative in the title, like Surrounded by Idiots, that implies that when you try to communicate with somebody and they don't get it, you're just like, what's wrong with them? In fact, it's not that they're an idiot or there's anything wrong with them. And again, not to be pejorative, but that's the book's title. It's rather that you may be choosing to display a facet that they're not really ready to receive, or they don't have the bandwidth to receive, or they don't have the lived experience to understand. And the lived experience part of it is what's important with intersectionality, because there are facets of you, there are domains of your personality that may not be obvious. So when you look at me, you wouldn't automatically know that I have endometriosis, which is something that affects 1 in 10 women. And most people have probably walked into a room and not realized that 1 in 10 women at least has endometriosis. And that affects your life. It affects many things. There are things that you do have control over, like you said, about the trajectory of your day and your life, and there are things you don't have control over. So that's an example that while, on the surface, I'm a physician, my background tells you that I'm at MIT. You can, see that I appear to be female and South Asian. There's all these other aspects of me that you may not know. That I have probably a different brain. I don't test positive for any particular this or that when I've been neurocognitive tested, just out of curiosity. But I have a different brain. And so I like to say that so as a scientist, we talk about statistics, and 2 standard deviations from the mean is you cross the line into abnormal. So I like to think that I'm 1.8 standard deviations from the mean. And I'm an outlier,
Malcolm Gladwell.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. Thank you. So I'm an outlier.
That's interesting, because you've said a great deal from the very beginning of the introduction of yourself in the 3 points, right? And so I heard empathy, and I remember reading a book, Compassionomics. And in Compassionomics, I think he talked about compassion is empathy in motion, right? And then I heard Pakistan, which I've had the pleasure of visiting, and actually doing some leadership training in Pakistan through the U.S. Embassy. And I heard oil company, which I worked for, Mobil Oil, in the past. But I think this whole piece of what you just described was the iceberg, right? The iceberg of maybe there's 15% of the iceberg above the water with 85% below the water. When we deal with, when we see people and they come in the room, that's why we like to get to the root of being human. What does it mean to be human? And I guess I'll ask that question of you. We were talking about intersectionality, because even at every intersection, what we're dealing with is a human being.
Correct.
Right. So what does it mean to you to be human?
That's a good question. Very philosophic. I will say, I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that. Because I think that I will also say, just to touch upon some less butterfly unicorn type of stuff, is I've worked in the pediatric emergency room. So I've also seen the underbelly of humanity, unfortunately. I think we are deeply flawed. And I think we aspire to be more than that. And I think there is, so my faith background is I'm Muslim, I'm Islam. And I know the word jihad has a negative connotation in how some people misinterpret it, including Muslim people. But there's a concept of a daily jihad, which to me actually maps to the introduction of this that we started with, that you have choices. Every moment, every day you have choices. And the jihad is just a struggle. Right. There's a concept of the nafs, or your desire, right? And then, or even if you look at psychology, there's the part of your brain that controls your breathing that you can't control. If you try to stop breathing, your body will take control, be like, you got to breathe. Right. Then there's your limbic system, which controls anger and, your more nether kind of desires and whatnot. right? And that is essential for your survival as an individual. So for fight or flight, or survival of the species. So like sexual desire. And then there's your cognition, which is your higher brain, right? And those are kind of in struggle, and they're in balance. And so to me, jihad is sort of like, do I have the piece of chocolate? Or
Yes, yes.
do I have the struggle?
Yes, yes.
If it's dark chocolate, is it okay? Because it's good for you.
Yes, 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 yes.
And now is my cognition kind of like coming to play with my desire, being like constructing a narrative that makes me feel good about myself? Or am I holding myself accountable to a higher standard? Right. So I think that, so maybe that's the answer to being human. Being human, hopefully, is to aspire to something greater than what you are. And to hopefully we have the strength of character to understand that we're flawed, and to not perceive that as weakness, but rather an opportunity to improve.
That's right.
So you said something earlier that really struck a chord with me as a surgeon, because you talked about this compassionate rationalism, right? And I'd love for you to explore that thought process a little bit more, because it truly resonates with me as a surgeon, because so many of the times that's exactly the space you find yourself in with patient care.
100%. And in fact, actually, so as you know, Doc Brown, I'm actually 3 months out from having had a surgery myself for endometriosis and fibroids, which is very common. And this, again, I think is another intersectionality issue, that while my appearance and where I've gone to school and the way I speak tends to kind of place me more what we call white adjacent, the issues that I had, like for instance, fibroids, is something that affects a lot of Black women. And, now that I've at midlife experienced things that affects, more Black women, and this is where empathy needs to be also have a rationality to it, because now that my own lived experience matches more that of a classic woman of color or Black woman, and I had to have a conversation with surgeons about, do I have a hysterectomy? And by the way, a hysterectomy affects 1 in 3 women in the United States. If this were affecting, and maybe this will be seen political and the way I'm saying it, but I have to ask, if this were affecting 1 in 3 white men, would we be amputating body parts? Right? So do you have to have the lived experience in order to have the compassion? But I don't think so, actually, because I would say, so to your point about as a surgeon, I feel like I got, and the woman who did my surgery was excellent, and I trusted her with my body and my health. That said, I will say that some of the best advice I've gotten are from white male surgeons on something that is typically a woman of color disease. And I feel like sometimes they are able to step back and not feel your feels with you in a way that allows them to have full access to their cognition without their limbic system, or what's called the lizard brain, or your threat center, activated. So I actually push back on those women who perceive that you can only go to a female doctor or a female provider, or, you have to share my experience before you can deliver good care to me. Because I do believe that you can be committed to problem solving and a good result. Perhaps if you are not experiencing the same trauma of being a woman in the healthcare system, perhaps you have more energy and problem solving ability to focus on getting to the solution. And that could be, for instance, the, equipoise, or the a little bit of clinical distance. So now we talk so much about empathy. But again, Paul Bloom actually points out that if you're feeling the feels with the patient, you might actually be too much in a space of trauma, or too much of a space of emotion, to activate the full ability of your data-driven cognition to really think about all the options. So I do find, like, for instance, some women surgeons, and this is not a criticism, this is merely an observation, themselves are so traumatized by what it is to have a uterus, first menstruation, then fibroids, then surgery. It's a lot of trauma. They're just like, oh my God, get it out. Just be done with it. Right. But then I think about it, I'm just like, well, let's just think logically for a second. Have either of you ever installed a big TV or a wall unit or anything in your house?
Yes. Yes.
Didn't you have to secure it really well? Right. So it doesn't fall on somebody.
Yes, absolutely.
Like, what is the purpose of a uterus? Granted, I have not used my uterus for biologic purposes, but it can hold up to a 14-pound fetus, right? Maybe even more. I mean, most fetuses are not that big, but they can get that big. Now think about, the body has to secure that organ with a lot of ligaments. That body has to provide, your body has to provide a lot of blood supply to grow an entire another human in there, and has nerves to contract, right? Now you're going to cut all of that when you amputate that organ, and you're going to tell me it has no long-term effects on my health, no long-term effects on my pelvic floor function, right? And so this is where I actually find that, when we talk about equity and diversity in healthcare, and we talk about increasing, women or minorities in healthcare, is it possible that because of how much we put onto these individuals, that you are the solution to these systemic problems? It's all you, go be a hero, right? Is that really realistic? And are we putting undue pressure on these? Like, it reminds me of that scene from Wonder Woman in the No Man's Land scene, where they're in the trenches, and the guys are just like, we can't stop for everybody, we got to move on, right? And she's like, no, I won't tolerate that. And she climbs out of the trenches, and she just personally by herself goes onto the battlefield, and she's deflecting bullets one by one with her, by the way, magical cuffs, which I don't have. By the way, with her shield given to her by her father Zeus, who's a god. And my dad is excellent, but he's not a god, by the way. And you're going to tell me, hey, Dr. Nihal Ambreen, go onto the battlefield by yourself because you're a strong woman of color. You can do it. You don't got no shield or cuffs, but you can do it, right? And then what does that do to me psychologically when society is telling me, you're strong, you're smart, you can do it by yourself. Go save all the women of color out there. Am I actually then, however you pumped me up while not providing me with the actual needed resources, am I going to deliver excellent care? Or actually is a white male surgeon who, when he says do this, it gets done, who is senior, and you know this, Doc Brown, you're a surgeon who's maybe the most senior in the hospital, therefore has the most access to OR time. Well, I maybe get the safest care with him. He's not personally feeling my feels, and he has access to the resources to get me, if I have an emergent something, he's got the OR time, he gets it done, right? And this is not a popular opinion, but this is a reality. And the reason I'm stating it is because it's not that I'm not as good as you, Doc Brown. I think I'm at least as good as you. But I also know that I'm human. I also know that I'm flawed, and if I'm really tired, it's possible I could make an error, and I should be aware of that. And to expect me to be a hero and not provide me the resources, and for me to provide for all women of color, is not fair, is not realistic, it's not safe. And I think that's where the rational compassion also comes in, right? Where you have to be able to say, so I could, out of ego, be like, I want to be the hero. Yes, that's me. Right? But if you have more a rational approach, you'd say, okay, but what is the system that surrounds me? What are the resources that I have? What are the outcomes I'm expected to deliver? And if those outcomes are not perfect, I don't take it personally like, oh my gosh, you're saying that I, as a female surgeon, am not good enough. No. Okay. Actually, as it turns out, female surgeons have excellent outcomes, sometimes, better. But we need to be able to remove ourselves. And that's where empathy gets dangerous, right? Because even if you think about like empathy, like walk in somebody else's shoes. When you like grammatically, when you say walk in somebody's shoes, the I is silent. The subject of that sentence is I walk in somebody's shoes. I feel your feels. The subject of that sentence is me, not you. So empathy centers actually on me and my feelings. And if I don't have a matching experience to yours and I can't believe that's where the not believing comes in. And so I do, though, believe that we can train people, including white male surgeons, to deliver excellent care to women of color if we don't center on the shared experience part, but saying, look, just like I'm flawed as a human being, we as flawed human beings create flawed science. Plus, if you're a real scientist, you understand that knowledge is infinite and we are finite. If you subtract something finite from infinity, you end up with infinity. There's an infinite amount of information we do not know. So as a scientist, you go into any situation saying, I only have a fraction of information. And so I shouldn't rely only on me and my knowledge. I shouldn't bring hubris into the OR. I shouldn't bring hubris into the exam room, right? I shouldn't bring hubris into clinical trials. I've kind of, gone on for quite a bit, so I'll pause.
There's a whole lot that you said there, right? We're talking about something that is systemic.
Correct.
And in order to change that, then you're really talking about transformation and the examination of mental models. That's what you're really talking about, right? So the challenge is, how do we begin to, brick by brick, deconstruct and reconstruct mental models that makes us see each other more human and understand that we are at these intersections daily. And as we are at the intersection, we may need to pause and say, this is a human being that I'm actually dealing with. How do we reconstruct that type of narrative and reality or perceived reality such that we can treat patients better?
So I'm a pediatrician. So there's some really funny videos by Dr. Glaucom Flecken, I think he is, right? It may not be pronouncing it. He makes some really funny videos about different specialties. But there's a really funny one where the pediatrician goes to the psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist is like, you need to spend more time around adults. And the pediatrician is like, why? And now that I'm in business school, I sometimes get feedback being like, she should have learned this already, right? Like, I think I haven't. Pediatricians basically are Peter Pans in some ways, and we don't want to grow up and deal with annoying adults. You two are pretty okay, though.
Well, thank you.
Appreciate that. I was fascinated by a lot of the discussion around the whole topic before with, the surgeon and all that meant, the systemic issues. And it's interesting, I had the opportunity to understand a little bit about the whole concept of endometriosis and hysterectomy. My wife went through that about, endometriosis, long time, but the hysterectomy part, I guess it's been almost 6.5, 7 years now. So that put me in a different space of understanding, like not the surgeon space, but the family space.
Sure.
And it's such a different thing. And one of the things I've always kind of tried to highlight as a paradox is, the physician is the authority on the medical condition, on the diagnosis, on the treatment possibilities, but the patient has authority in terms of decision rights of what's right for them, and how that process of co-creation comes together between patient and physician is so important to getting the right treatment, right? The patient has to be informed adequately, which is challenged at best because so frequently, unlike in your case where, you own the medical language because you are a physician, so that's different conversations. A lot of times with patients, there's a language barrier there, just in, medical versus whatever their native language is. So expand a little bit on that whole idea of what that intersection looks like and how it gets successfully navigated to a good treatment plan.
Absolutely. So first, I think I actually didn't finish answering the other question. The quick answer to how do you deconstruct it is to have the beginner's mind or the child mind, right? And to have that growth mindset. And I think that a lot of the challenges that come into play when we is coming from being too stiff and too adult, perhaps.
Yes.
Right. And having this built up ego and not wanting to acknowledge that you've done anything wrong. And it's a perception, it's a very moralistic attitude of right versus wrong, as opposed to believing we're all inherently flawed. There's an infinite amount of knowledge that we can never know, that expands throughout the universe. And so we need to approach things with curiosity and humility, and to be under. And so whenever somebody corrects you, it's not a correction, it's just learning. And I will say, having been in the diversity spaces, there are times when somebody of a more marginalized identity than mine will say, no, I'm correcting you. And I you can feel it, right? There's you are wrong, and I want you to understand you're wrong. And that can be hard. And I'm not saying that it's been easy to take that, but I understand that it is coming. I try to have empathy there and have understanding for the place where it's coming from, right? That this is a person who has been denied authority. And I am a physician. I have MIT and Harvard attached to me, and from Pakistan, a similar, institution, Aga Khan. So there's somebody may have a need to show to the world, I, as a regular human being, have the authority over this seemingly authority to correct her and tell her she is wrong. And that I need to be able to accept that, right? So to somebody, to be corrected in public by, quote, non-authority, they might find that humiliating. They might find that demeaning. But why is it demeaning, right? All it means is that there may genuinely be a learning need for me, and I need to humbly accept it and thank the person for identifying an opportunity for me to learn, right? And then to your point, Doc Brown, about sort of, I think the last time we talked about this, I had a similar tweak on how you described it, which is that I think even though we as physicians get a little frustrated with Doc Google, and we're probably going to end up with Doc Chat GPT pretty soon.
That's true.
If not already. Reality is that there's such a vastness to the advance of science. And we are busy trying to get our charts written, in EHR, which adds 3 hours to our day. We're trying to, actually talk to patients now, right, and spend time with them and answering messages via the EHR that are, outside of the visit, that it is frankly impossible for any, no matter how smart or how dedicated or how many honors they got in med school, any doctor or nurse or anybody to keep up with all of the literature. So I do think that we as clinicians have to remember that the patient is obsessed with their disease because they're living it every day. And they may genuinely have more knowledge than we do sometimes, right? So I, for instance, educated my surgeons, albeit I'm a physician myself and, blah, blah, blah. But I educated my surgeons that, by the way, did you know that there's a link between migraines and endometriosis? It's an emerging area that I only found out via Twitter, actually, because I was following a researcher who's in the weeds of this advancing edge of science. Right. So I think that is, and that, that also gets to the fact that there's a systemic aspect to these diseases that seem to be localized. More recently, I've been learning about psoriasis, same thing. It's seen as a skin disease. In fact, it actually we know it affects joints or psoriatic arthritis, but there's, again, emerging evidence around it affecting hearts, right? Like there's inflammatory markers around hearts or something. I'm just learning. I'm going to say it wrong. I don't know exactly what it is. I'm learning about it. But that's where the patient does have authority over their body and their choices, but they are also having a lived experience of something that where maybe science has not yet investigated. Right. And there's an unfortunately very long history of calling patients crazy, particularly women patients, particularly women of color patients. And that's where, again, I think we always have to walk into any room saying there's a vastness of knowledge. There's an infinite amount of knowledge that I do not have. And as a scientist, I am committed to advancing knowledge, and I'm committed to honest, and having equipoise, like not being you need passion on one hand, but being overly passionate, again, sometimes becomes ego.
Yeah. It's such, you hit us on such an important topic. The volume of medical knowledge doubles 5 to 6 times per year, right? Mm-hmm. Like every 70 days or something like that. And so none of us, no matter how intelligent, no matter how driven we are, has even the remotest hope of being able to keep up. And that's why we really need enough humility to be able to listen. Mm-hmm. And I kind of put it into a 3-part thing as I go through. On the one hand, I have nothing to prove, but I also have a lot to learn, and I also have plenty to offer. Mm-hmm. And that thinking in that construct allows space for new information to enter and not be a threat to me. Because when you talked about that whole ego thing, one of the things that gets driven at you in medical training, of course, is that you're supposed to be the expert and have all the answers, and it's not possible, for that to really be the case. But that doesn't mean we don't all feel the pressure for it to be true. And to the extent that we can get ourselves, as Terry would say, that we can deconstruct that mental model and come together with a better model that takes us to a more successful place in how we navigate this changing information, it really helps us be better servants to our patients and better stewards of our own mental health, for that matter.
Exactly. I mean, whether it's what I was describing before about, being Wonder Woman on the field, which is unrealistic. And yet I feel like, I feel like women in today's world, like, oh, go forward, go lead. Okay, well, where's my administrative assistant to help me just stay scheduled, right? And, this is a reality, right? So there's a book written by a couple of women leaders on the world stage, and it's published by MIT Press. One of them is actually a Nigerian woman who pointed out, because in Nigeria, women wear a headdress. And so she actually wears the same thing every day, so that for 2 reasons. One is that if you look at Obama and you look at Zuckerberg, Obama always wore the blue suit, Zuckerberg always wore the gray t-shirt. The more that you simplify, the more fewer decisions you have to make, because we know that brains have decision fatigue. So we need to be able to outsource more things. And it's not because you're an egotistical doctor or whatever. It is because you want to you recognize that you're human. We have decision fatigue, and you want to reserve the most important decisions for what most affects your patient. Right. So, in this case of this Nigerian leader, she also said that unfortunately with women, what you wear becomes a topic of discussion. So she just wears the same kind of thing all the time to remove that from the topic of discussion about her, so that there can be more focus on her work. Right. And so, and I think since we're talking about, diversity as well, I do think that becomes a big issue that we have to talk about, which is hair discrimination for Black women. Right. And so there was a Crown Act that was recently passed to allow women to wear natural hair. There's recent, so for me, like you guys know, I hadn't realized this was going live. So I was just like, oh my God, give me a second. I just like brushed my hair and I was ready. Right. Whereas some women, in order to be perceived as acceptable by societal standards, which are Eurocentric, spend like 3 hours and put chemicals in their hair just to straighten it. And then now there's increasing evidence coming from the NIH or NIH funded studies that those straight hair straighteners, those chemicals could be causing uterine cancer. Mm-hmm. Right. So what is it that society is enforcing on with Eurocentric standards? And I mean, in that way, whether you want to call it lucky, then so-called I got lucky because my facial features, my hair, my skin color, are again white adjacent. And this is terminology that I've learned more recently. And at first it kind of maybe seemed like awkward to say it, like what's the big deal? But then when I think about it, that there are girls in school who are being policed out of school for their hair. Just because, if you believe in God, the way God or nature caused your hair to grow, which is natural and normal for you, is the reason now you're not going to be in school. And now, rather, like, to me, I love school. It's just like this amazing place, right? But if your experience of school as a child was getting policed, there's also evidence that little Black boys as young as 3 in the United States, as well as little Muslim boys in the UK, get suspended, get seen as criminal or dangerous. And again, this is not critiquing. Maybe it is critiquing culture, but I mean, if you go into, I'm not Christian, but if you go into most churches, baby Jesus is not Black, right? And so what are the constant image now we have more diversity in commercials like the Gerber baby or whatever, but generally speaking, when you think of the angelic this, that, or whatever, it is probably not a Black child. And so these things end up unintentionally, maybe without any malice, informing how we think of innocence and how we think of purity, right? And so those are images that are in a woman's, like not in a woman or man's mind, if he's like a preschool, teacher, about who's innocent. And so there's a lot of research that's done that shows that, and I mean, as a pediatrician, I've definitely seen those little men, little Black boys who've got these they formed muscles. And I'm just like, dude, I want those muscles myself, But, I do not have Michelle Obama arms at all. There's a reason why they're covered. I mean, I also don't put in the work, I'll acknowledge. It's not just genetics, right? But these are all the things that are swirling around us that are what lead to implicit bias. That and I mean there's internalized bias too, right? So I make a real effort for my hair to be so-called not frizzy, right? What is frizzy? Frizzy is my looking more ethnic, right? And that's my being like, oh my gosh, that's going to be unprofessional, that's going to distract people from me. And so I think this is also something that we have to create space for and be tolerant of. That, while yes, there's some things you can choose, a woman can choose to wear exactly the same thing every day so that her appearance so-called doesn't distract. But there's also times when so-called professionalism wrongly labels the way that God or nature made you to be as, quote, unprofessional. And therefore you must alter your appearance to fit in to, quote, not distract us. I'm sorry, but that's hogwash. What does it mean to be human, you asked? What it means to be human is there's not one kind of human being. We come in different colors and shapes and sizes and with different hair or no hair, right? And there's a book that I'm reading, Diverse by Design, about, to the point we were talking about earlier about how do we need to construct spaces or society or systems. And so, to poke a little fun at myself, because I'm, over 40, now whenever I go through the airport, I always get flagged and patted down here. And I'm always like, oh, that's just my perimenopausal back fat, I guess. And of course I just make them a little uncomfortable. It's not an appropriate thing to say, but why not? I'm over 40, I'm in perimenopause, right? And your machine believes that a woman only looks one way, which is, I guess, the way a woman looks under 40, right? So I rambled quite a bit. So, take that wherever you want to go.
You described quite a bit of some of my lived experiences being a black male in America. And Dr. Brown and I have talked about it quite often. But what I'm interested in is really solutions, right? Solutions to having more equity in the healthcare space, having more equity as I think when we look at each other as human beings, that creates, I guess, some equity and equality. At least that's what I think. And I think I heard Dr. Brown say in a conversation he and I had, and that is that justice, poverty equals, was it justice?
Yeah, the opposite of poverty is justice.
And so, how can we get justice and equity in the healthcare space, in your opinion?
So there's another book that I'm reading called Data Feminism.
Okay.
And even though it's about feminism, it is about intersectional feminism. And so I think that it has some solutions that I think are important. So one of the things that it talks about is, creating, I think we need to think about, so we're in a data-driven world, right? Whether you like data or don't like data, it is a new currency. So I think that one thing I would say, and I would say coming from a community myself that is under surveillance and has been harmed, even though I'm not suggesting that Muslims have always been perfect, but there are certain structural and policy and policing mechanisms, which then cause my community, for instance, to be distrustful of government, distrustful of technology. But all that ends up, and there's also been some colonizers that deliberately used education to indoctrinate. So there's a distrust sometimes of Western education. But what that does is that this is a debate, right? But my position is that ultimately that keeps you at the margins, and you're not engaging with progress. And again, from an Islamic perspective, there's sometimes people will talk about innovation and religion as a bad thing because it's set or whatever. Interpretation is certainly allowed. So I think that people of more traditional backgrounds sometimes can perceive innovation as changing things that are set in stone. But I actually think among scholars, there's opportunity to consider where, as human beings endowed with a brain and with sense and with knowledge, we're allowed to make progress. So I think that's a framing for, we as those of marginalized communities do need to engage with data. I think, was it Toni Morrison who said that definitions belong to the definers, not the defined?
Yes. Yes.
So data is going to define you. Be one of the definers. Don't be one of the defined, right? So get to that table. If there's tech being made, learn tech. Why am I at MIT as a pediatrician, right? A public health pediatrician who basically just kind of wants to sit back and be like, you're growing fine, keep doing it. I'll just take credit.
It's interesting that you say that, because I just made a post on Facebook the other day that says, those who make the definitions rule. Yeah. And so it's interesting that because that is what it is. It's really about creating your own or co-creating your own, right? And redefine. That's right.
Exactly. No, 100%. And so that's what I'm learning from data feminism is that also there are a lot of communities like indigenous communities, Latin America, even though the Mongols were not really loved by most people in history because they did some bad stuff, but the Mongols had an oral tradition. And so you could also argue, were Mongols so bad or they didn't write things down, so the writing about them is by other people? Right? I went to an all-girls school. We used to joke that it's history, his story, written by men. Right? So you got to be at the table. You got to be writing. You got to be publishing. You got to be doing this, be on podcasts or writing, doing your own podcast. You've got to be creating. And in a world now with ChatGPT, the transcript of this might be taken by ChatGPT to, incorporate an answer. Right. So I'm not, I would critique personal responsibility a little bit because I think too often it is used as a justification to deny what is systemic. But I would also say that there is some aspect, like going back to how the intro was, that you do make choices at these intersections and you do have some personal control. So what can you do to ensure that your identity is being measured or described in the right way? Right? I mean, I worked in insurance, and typically most doctors hate other doctors who worked in insurance because you're the bad guy. But part of the reason I worked in insurance was that we were going towards value-based care, and somebody was defining quality. And I wanted to be at that table defining quality. And I wanted to be somebody who was at the table. I've been in compliance. I've done policing of fellow doctors. Right. And I wanted to be the person who's like, my community is being policed. So just because your quote gut feeling is that XYZ is right or wrong does not make it right or wrong. Let's look at the data. Let's be logical. Let's have rational compassion. Sometimes the people who end up in compliance spaces have been personally harmed and they want to be the police. Right? But now you're, again, trauma driven. And again, not to be ableist, I think we must be trauma informed, but we also have to be honest with ourselves when it is trauma that is driving our quote gut feeling. And in fact, when I've when I've been trained in mindfulness, they actually teach you not to say gut feeling. Because as a pediatrician, it makes sense. When a child is nervous or getting bullied in school, where does it show up? They have a tummy ache. I don't want to go to school. I have a tummy ache. Drill down, turns out there's a bully at school, right? So your gut feeling is actually probably more your limbic system, your so-called lizard brain, as it's called. And so rather than respond to your gut feeling, use deep intuition. And intuition is a combination of your lived experience and data with a dose of humility. So going back to the data feminism, one of the things it talks about is using qualitative data, which is recording stories, right? So then you capture the stories that women tell to each other, that indigenous people tell to each other, it gets lost. Right? Because too often the data that we refer to are again, I'm not trying to, call anybody out, but just state a reality, is created by white men, right? And it's not out of malice. It's just how it has been, right? For whatever reason. You could read Guns, Germs, and Steel and get to some reasons as to why that is. And not out of malice, but if before I realized I had endometriosis and fibroids, I lived with it for years. And actually, I was one of those people who didn't have severe menstrual pain. If somebody was like, oh, menstruation is a real problem, it causes people to, I probably been like, maybe you just need to toughen up a bit, right? I mean, I might have been one of those women because I didn't experience it. I'm like, I'm a woman. Doesn't affect me, right? And so that's where we can't over-center on ourselves. We have to have diversity at the table, and diversity that checks off multiple things. So I might check off the box of woman and minority or Muslim, but until I actually stopped, I addressed the internalized ableism within myself, where I was suppressing my own feelings and just powering through, and denying that I was in pain or having problems, which is rewarded in American culture, which is rewarded as a child of immigrants. I mean, literally in one day at the hospital, a nurse said to me, she's like, "Oh, you're one of the good ones. You follow the rules, not like those people who come here for a handout." You know, and so right, and like, what would be a handout, by the way? If I were feeling ill and I took a sick day, and you know, she's let me know that she was descended from people who fought in the Revolutionary War. You know, so she's letting me know that she belongs. She's a gatekeeper of my validity, and I need to be a so-called good one before I'm allowed in her space. And I mean, this is not, I mean, I'm not hierarchical, but I mean, I'm just, reality is that the language of medicine, it might be wrong, maybe we need to change it. The language of medicine is that as a doctor, I write so-called orders, right? Which has been kind of militaristic language. And so if a child is having the blood pressure drop or going into anaphylactic reaction, I need nurses around me to respond to me the same way they would respond to Doc Brown, and not be assessing whether I'm a good one, good enough for them to respond to me, because they're assessing me and my identity and my belonging and my validity as a doctor in a hospital is a danger to my patients, to our patients, not just my patient.
To humanity. It's a danger to humanity.
Yeah.
It's a danger to humanity. And I'm not practicing at this time. And I'm, you know, looking, and I'll be honest, these kinds of seemingly innocent comments are not innocent.
Yeah, this has been such a rich discussion that we could practically have a master class based on what we've covered here today. And we're really grateful to you for spending so much time with us, Dr. Nahal. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us at the intersection today. If you want to see all of our episodes, they're available at unlikelyintersection.com or on our YouTube channel, Unlikely Intersections, as well as on Facebook, where this aired live this morning. I'm at LinkedIn, Doc Philip Brown. Terry?
You can find me, Terry Jackson, PhD, on LinkedIn as well as on Facebook. And again, thank you so very much for going into some of the weeds that needed to be gone into today. Absolutely. In your conversation. We thank you so very much.
And where can we find you? Where can our listeners?
Yes, I'm on LinkedIn, and you can probably see my name. It will be on the thing. But I do actually just want to let's end on a positive note, because, you know, I'd like to always have the sticker, the popsicle as a version. So I think that there's a lot of unconscious things that we do, and to map back to what you said at the beginning, we have intersections every day. So let's lean into growth mindset. Let's be a little bit more intentional, conscious, and, you know, co-create, as you said, right? So think about all of those opportunities, and yeah, to think about humanity and the beautiful diversity within humanity.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. And listeners, thank you again.
Thank you.